This is my true story. I raised my son with everything I had. I worked long hours, skipped meals, and went without so he could live in comfort. I thought when I grew old, he would at least remember who made that possible. One evening, I decided to surprise him for dinner, to show up with his favorite meal and a mother's love. But what I found waiting on his porch changed everything I believed about family. I didn't cry, I just acted. And the next morning, when he found my note, his hand started shaking. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. It was a Friday evening when I decided to visit my son, Daniel. I hadn't seen him in months, and I thought maybe a home-cooked meal might bring us back together, even just for one dinner. I spent the whole afternoon cooking his favorite dishes: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, and the apple pie recipe his father used to love. I packed everything carefully into a basket, the kind of simple gesture that used to mean something before distance and pride took over our family. The drive to his house was quiet, an hour down the same road I used to take when he was a boy and called me every week. I remembered how, years ago, he'd wait at the door when he heard my car pulling up. This time the driveway was full of unfamiliar cars. The lights were on, music played faintly from inside, and I thought maybe there was a dinner happening. Maybe I had accidentally walked into a family gathering. My heart lifted a little at the idea of being included again, of surprising him, of sitting at the same table I helped pay for. I parked near the mailbox, picked up the basket, and started walking toward the porch, smiling before I even saw the door. I imagined the look on his face, the surprise, the hug, the awkward laugh when he'd say I didn't have to do this. But that moment never came. Instead, I saw something else waiting for me, something small and heavy that told me without a single word that I no longer belonged there. There it was, my old travel bag, the one I kept at his house for overnight visits, with my reading glasses, a spare sweater, and a toothbrush inside. It sat neatly on the porch beside the welcome mat, zipped up tight, as if waiting to be collected like a package. The sight of it froze me. My hand tightened around the basket handle. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake, that he had cleaned out the guest room and meant to call me about it. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message, one that said I had overstayed my welcome in a life I had built for him. I looked at the door. There were voices inside, laughter, plates clinking, music playing softly. A dinner, just not one I was invited to. The curtain shifted slightly, and I thought I saw someone glance out, but I couldn't be sure. My chest felt tight, not from anger, but from realization. I had spent so many years believing love was something that never expired, that being a mother meant always having a place at the table. But that night, standing there with food in my hands and my bag at my feet, I understood that sometimes even mothers get left outside. I set the basket down next to the bag, careful not to make a sound. I didn't want to embarrass anyone or make a scene. I wasn't angry enough to knock or shout. I was too tired for that. I just stared at that door for a few more seconds, memorizing the home that used to feel like mine, the porch where I once read bedtime stories to a little boy sitting on my lap. Then I picked up my car keys, turned around, and walked back to the car. The night air felt colder than it should have, and the smell of the food made my stomach twist. I got in, closed the door, and looked at the house through the windshield. The laughter inside continued, soft and distant, like it belonged to another world. I started the engine, took one last look at the porch, at the bag that had replaced my welcome, and drove away. The road home was empty, long, and silent. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I just drove with both hands on the wheel, knowing something in me had changed forever. That bag on the porch said everything words never could. It was old but familiar. The brown leather handle slightly worn, the zipper still half broken from the last time I stayed over and told him I'd replace it someday. I had left it in his guest room months earlier, full of small comforts, a few clothes, an old photo album, a bottle of my favorite lotion, and a book I never finished. He once told me to keep it there because his house was my home too. I guess that promise expired quietly, without notice. Seeing it sitting there like lost luggage outside a stranger's door felt colder than winter. I didn't need anyone to explain it. I understood it immediately. My presence had become an inconvenience, my visits a disruption. Maybe his wife had finally said what she'd been thinking for years. Maybe he agreed. Maybe they both decided it was easier to let me find out like this, without confrontation. The sad part was that I wasn't surprised. I had seen the distance growing, the shorter calls, the missed birthdays, the polite excuses, but still, part of me had believed that deep down, family was something you couldn't return like an unwanted package. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. Maybe someone would realize I was there, maybe they'd say it was a misunderstanding, but the lights inside didn't flicker and the laughter didn't stop. The music played on, muffled behind the walls I once helped paint when he first bought the place. I could almost hear his voice from years ago, proud, showing me the kitchen, saying, "This is your spot, Mom. You'll always have a place here." Funny how people forget their promises when comfort turns into embarrassment. I looked down at the basket still in my hand, the food I had cooked, still warm, still untouched. For a second, I thought about leaving it by the door as a reminder that I came not to take, but to give. And that's exactly what I did. I placed it beside the bag, side by side, one symbol of love, one symbol of rejection. They looked strange together, a quiet conversation between two objects that understood what I couldn't say out loud. The porch light above flickered once, maybe from the breeze, or maybe just because it knew what was happening. I picked up my car keys, my legs heavier than before, and walked back to the car without turning back. I didn't knock. I didn't call his name. I didn't want to see pity on his face or explanation in his eyes. There are moments when silence teaches louder than words ever could. That was one of them. I sat in the car for a minute before starting the engine, my reflection staring back at me from the window. I looked tired, older than I remembered, but strangely calm. I had imagined surprise, hugs, maybe even tears of joy. Instead, I got silence, walls, and a porch that spoke volumes. I thought of how easily people rewrite the meaning of family when it stops serving them. The drive back home felt longer than usual. The night seemed darker, not because of the lack of light, but because of what I carried inside me. Every mile reminded me that something had ended without closure. I reached for the small cross hanging from my rearview mirror and held it between my fingers as I drove. I wasn't praying for him. I was praying for myself, for strength to accept what love sometimes becomes when it grows one-sided. When I reached the end of his street, I took one last glance in the mirror. The house was still bright, full of people, full of noise. But for the first time, I realized it wasn't my house anymore, and he wasn't really my son in the same way anymore either. Not the boy who used to hug me after dinner or call me just to tell me goodnight. The man in that house had made a choice, and I had seen it with my own eyes. That bag on the porch was more than luggage. It was closure. The drive home that night was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace but from something breaking inside. The road looked the same as it always did, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Every passing streetlight flashed against the windshield like small reminders of moments I didn't realize were the last. The last time he called me Mom with warmth. The last time I sat at his table. The last time I felt welcome in his life. The car smelled like roast and apple pie, the dinner I made for a family that had already moved on without me. I gripped the steering wheel and told myself not to cry. I kept thinking about how love, when taken for granted, becomes invisible until it's gone. When he was a little boy, he used to run down that same street when I picked him up from school, waving his arms, shouting my name like I was the only person in the world that mattered. Now, years later, I had to drive away from his house like a stranger leaving a crime scene. I wasn't angry yet. I was just numb, trying to understand how kindness turned into rejection so quietly that I didn't even notice the shift happening. The headlights cut through the darkness as I turned onto the long stretch leading back to my small house. I passed the park where I used to take him on weekends, where he'd beg for ice cream even in winter. It all felt like it belonged to someone else's life now. I thought about how people grow up and forget the hands that fed them, the voice that told them they'd be something one day. I remembered how proud I was when he bought that house, how I helped with the down payment, how I painted the guest room myself because I wanted it to feel like home whenever I visited. That room didn't exist anymore. Neither did the version of him who said I'd always have a place. I didn't stop anywhere on the way back. I didn't turn on the radio or call anyone. I didn't even look at the phone that kept lighting up beside me from some unknown number. I just drove. When I reached my driveway, the house looked darker than usual. The porch light had gone out earlier that week, but I hadn't gotten around to fixing it. It seemed fitting now, the kind of darkness that matched how I felt. I carried the same emptiness inside that I once tried to fill with family dinners, laughter, and plans for holidays. I sat in the car for a while before getting out, listening to the sound of the engine cooling. The silence after that was heavy but honest. It was the sound of being truly alone, not just physically, but in the way that comes from being forgotten by the people you thought would never do that to you. When I finally walked inside, the smell of old furniture and faint perfume from years of memories filled the air. I set my keys on the counter, took off my coat, and sat at the table where I once hosted birthdays and Thanksgiving dinners. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to sound like it was counting down the years I'd given up for him. I thought about calling him one last time, to ask why, to tell him I didn't deserve that kind of goodbye. But I stopped myself. I didn't need an answer. The bag on the porch had already spoken for him. It said everything I needed to know about what I meant to him now. I walked to my bedroom and passed the framed photo of us from years ago, me holding him at his graduation, proud tears in my eyes. I picked it up, looked at it for a few seconds, and put it face down. I didn't break it or throw it away. I just couldn't bear to look at it anymore. That night, I lay in bed wide awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that sometimes the people you give your life to will leave you out of theirs without warning. But in that quiet, as the hours passed, I also realized something else. I wasn't powerless. I still had choices. I still had my dignity. And I was going to remind him of that, not through anger, not through shouting, but through something far more lasting, silence and action. The next morning, the daylight didn't feel warm. It poured through the curtains like a reminder that the world kept moving, even when your heart didn't. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold and tried to understand what had actually happened. The night before had felt like a bad dream, but the emptiness in my chest confirmed it was real. My son, Michael, had quietly decided that I no longer belonged in the life I built for him. I thought about how small the moment was. No shouting, no argument, no dramatic ending, just a bag left on a porch. That was all it took to erase decades of sacrifice, care, and unconditional love. I replayed memories like a slideshow I didn't want to watch. The mornings I drove him to school in the rain, the nights I stayed up sewing his costumes for plays, the bills I worked double shifts to pay so he could go to college. All those things led to a single moment where I stood on his porch, unwanted. It was strange how love could survive so much and still break from silence alone. I remembered his wife, Amanda. She had always been polite, but distant in the kind of way that feels like a wall behind a smile. She made subtle comments over the years about privacy, space, modern families needing boundaries. I ignored them because I wanted to believe she was just protective of her own home. But maybe she had been planning my distance all along. Maybe Michael let her. I couldn't even blame her entirely. It wasn't her job to protect me. It was his, and he didn't. The truth hit hard, not in anger, but in a deep, quiet sadness. For years, I had made excuses for his absence, told friends he was just busy, told myself that love didn't need constant proof. But that bag on the porch was proof enough of what love had turned into, of how easy it was to abandon what once felt sacred. I walked around the house that morning, touching the furniture he helped me move, the photos still hanging on the walls. In one, he's a little boy wearing a red baseball cap, smiling so big his eyes disappeared. I used to think that smile was my reward for everything I went through in life. But now, looking at it, I felt like I had raised someone who learned success but forgot gratitude. That realization hurt more than anything. I wasn't just unwanted. I was unnecessary. I wasn't part of his family story anymore, just a footnote in his past. But what he didn't realize was that the same strength that raised him still lived in me. I wasn't going to fall apart quietly. I wasn't going to beg for love that had conditions. So I made a decision right there at that table. I took out my old file box, the one that held property papers, insurance forms, and banking documents, and laid them all out. I started reviewing everything that had my name on it, everything connected to me, everything that still belonged fully to me. My hands didn't shake, my eyes didn't blur with tears. It wasn't revenge I was planning. It was closure. He wanted to cut me off emotionally, but I was about to make sure he couldn't control me financially or symbolically either. He would learn, not through words, but through consequences, what it meant to underestimate someone who had given him everything. By the time I finished sorting those papers, I wasn't just a forgotten mother anymore. I was a woman reclaiming control of her life. And while he slept peacefully in the comfort of a home I had helped him afford, I was preparing the quiet answer that would remind him exactly who made that comfort possible. That evening, I sat at the same table where I used to help Michael with his homework. The smell of old paper and coffee filled the room, and the ticking clock reminded me I had wasted too many years waiting for appreciation that would never come. I took out a single sheet of white stationery, smooth and thick, the kind I used for birthdays and thank you cards. But this wasn't either of those. I wasn't writing out of love or celebration. I was writing to close a chapter. I didn't want to sound bitter or dramatic. I wanted clarity, the kind that ends confusion forever. So I began simply, thanking him for being my son, for the memories, for the laughter that once filled our lives. I wrote about how proud I had been to watch him grow, how proud I still was that he built a life of his own. But then I shifted to the truth, that pride fades when respect disappears, that silence and neglect are louder than words, and that the bag on the porch had said everything he was too cowardly to say himself. I didn't write to hurt him. I wrote so that he would never again wonder what broke us. Beside the letter, I placed a small envelope containing property transfer papers. For years, I had kept my house and savings under both our names, believing it would make life easier when I was gone. That night, I signed them all over to myself exclusively and removed his name from every single document. I added a note at the bottom of the letter that said, "You will always have my love, but not my trust." It was short. It was enough. I sealed the envelope with the steadiness of someone who had spent her whole life giving and had finally decided to stop. I didn't cry once while writing. I didn't hesitate. I addressed it neatly, double-checked the stamps, and walked to the mailbox under the faint streetlight outside. The night was quiet. The air felt heavier than usual but freeing at the same time. When I dropped the envelope inside, I felt something shift inside me, like I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for too long. Walking back into the house, I noticed how still everything was. The walls didn't echo with laughter anymore. The photo frames didn't feel like reminders of love. They felt like evidence of what I had survived. I sat back down, folded my hands, and looked at the blank space on the table where the letter had been. I realized that sometimes closure isn't about confrontation. It's about reclaiming your voice in silence. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't replay memories. I didn't imagine his face when he'd read the letter. I just let the quiet wrap around me. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the kitchen as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The mug I used for coffee looked the same, but I didn't feel the same woman holding it. I was lighter, stronger, and done waiting for people who saw me as a burden. I walked to the mirror, looked at my reflection, and saw peace instead of pain. I smiled faintly, not out of joy, but out of acceptance. That letter wasn't written in anger. It was written in truth. And the truth, when finally spoken, has a way of setting you free. I knew by now the mail would be picked up. In a few hours, he would find it. He would open it and see the words that didn't need shouting. He would see his name erased from the one place he never expected, my life's foundation. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need an apology. I just needed him to understand that love has boundaries too. That was my note. Not a goodbye, but a full stop. The next morning, I woke up early. The sky was gray, and the air had that stillness that usually comes before something big happens. I sat by the window with my tea, calm but alert, knowing the moment was coming. Around 8, I saw the mail truck stop in front of his house across town through the live feed of my home camera app, the one I had set up years ago for security, the one he probably forgot existed. I watched as the postman walked up, placed the letter on his porch, and left. It sat there for a few hours untouched, sunlight slowly spreading across the white envelope. Then I saw him open the door, still in his casual clothes, holding a coffee cup and looking half asleep. He picked up the envelope with a puzzled look, probably expecting a greeting card or some leftover paperwork. He didn't even sit down before tearing it open. His posture stiffened halfway through reading. He froze in place, the paper shaking slightly in his hands. The moment I'd waited for had arrived. He realized what he had done. The documents were straightforward. My lawyer had made sure of that. Every shared asset, every account, every signature that once linked our names was officially undone. The house he once called his second home, gone. The insurance policies that included him as a beneficiary, gone. The small trust fund I'd set up for his daughter's college was still there, untouched, because children are never to blame for their parents' arrogance, but everything else now belonged solely to me. There was no loophole, no argument, no second chance. He couldn't undo it. As he read, I imagined his expression changing from confusion to realization, from realization to regret, and finally to that quiet panic that comes when people understand they've gone too far. I didn't need to be there to see it. I could feel it. I knew him well enough to know that guilt doesn't make noise. It makes people shake. I didn't expect him to call right away. He needed time for the shock to turn into humility. I went on with my day as usual. I cleaned the house, made soup for myself, and even played music for the first time in months. Every small act felt like reclaiming something I had given up long ago. Control. Around noon, my phone started buzzing. It rang once, then again, and again, until the missed call count reached 12. I didn't answer. He had used silence as a weapon for years. Now it was my turn. I wanted him to sit in that uncertainty, to wonder if I was angry or indifferent, because in truth I wasn't either. I was finished. By the afternoon, a friend who lived nearby called to tell me she had seen him sitting outside his house, head in his hands, the letter still beside him. She said his face looked pale, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. I didn't ask for more details. I didn't need them. He was finally feeling what I had felt on his porch, the sting of rejection, the weight of regret, the cold of being left outside by someone you love. It was poetic, but not in a soft way, in the kind of way that life eventually balances itself when you least expect it. That night, I checked my phone again. He hadn't sent another message, no apology, no explanation, just silence. And that silence was enough. It meant he understood. I sat back in my chair, watching the lights flicker in the distance, feeling no anger, no revenge, only calm. Sometimes the deepest justice isn't loud or cruel. It's simply giving someone exactly what they gave you, distance. That morning he found my note. That afternoon he learned its meaning. And that night he finally felt what I had felt, not hate, not pain, but realization. By the next morning, my phone had turned into a confession booth. It kept ringing from the same number over and over again, each call carrying a mix of panic and shame that I didn't need to hear to understand. I let it ring every single time. I wasn't avoiding him out of spite. I just wanted him to feel the weight of what silence can do. For months, I had been the one waiting by the phone, hoping he'd check in, hoping he'd ask how I was doing. Now it was his turn to wait, to stare at a screen that stayed blank, to wonder what it meant when someone you took for granted finally stopped answering. By noon, there were 12 missed calls. By the afternoon, 14. My hand hovered over the phone once, but I pulled it back. I remembered the porch, the bag, and that moment of humiliation when love turned into dismissal. He had earned this silence. It wasn't cruel. It was fair. Late in the evening, the phone rang again. I looked at it for a long time before answering. His voice was trembling before he even spoke. He didn't know where to begin. I could hear it in his breath, that mix of guilt and disbelief that comes when pride finally collapses. He said he didn't mean to hurt me, that it was all a misunderstanding, that leaving my bag on the porch was not what it looked like. I listened quietly. Every word sounded like an excuse built on regret. When he finally ran out of sentences, I told him I had understood his message perfectly the night I saw that bag. I told him that actions say what words never will. He stayed silent, like he wanted to argue but knew there was no point. I said one last thing before hanging up, that I had stopped waiting for apologies the day I stopped waiting for visits. Then I ended the call. Afterward, I sat in the quiet house and thought about how strange it felt to not be angry anymore. Anger takes energy, and I didn't have the desire to waste any more of mine on disappointment. He would think the letter was revenge, but it wasn't. It was correction, a necessary line drawn after years of letting boundaries fade. People like to call it tough love, but there was nothing tough about it. It was simply love that refused to be stepped on again. My decision wasn't meant to destroy him. It was meant to remind him. Respect is not inherited. It's earned, and once it's gone, you have to rebuild it brick by brick. The phone didn't ring again that night. The silence that followed was almost soothing. I cleaned the kitchen, folded the blankets, and sat by the window where the moonlight poured across the floor. I thought about how much time I had spent trying to make things right, trying to fix relationships that didn't value me. That phase of my life was over. I didn't need to explain my choices. The papers I signed, the note I left, they spoke louder than anything I could ever say. Somewhere in his house, my son was finally sitting with his own thoughts, realizing that love has limits and that age does not mean weakness. I didn't celebrate or feel triumphant. I just felt calm. The kind of calm that comes after finally being done with something that has weighed you down for years. When I went to bed that night, the phone was still by my side. I looked at it one last time before turning off the light. I knew he would call again eventually, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of fear, or maybe just to test if I'd still answer. But this time, I would choose when and how I responded. Because from now on, the balance had shifted. The silence belonged to me. The next day arrived quietly, but the consequences were already in motion. I woke up early, made my breakfast, and went about my day as usual, but I could feel the air was different, heavier, expectant. Around mid-morning, my lawyer called to confirm that all final documents had been processed. My son's name was officially removed from my estate, my accounts, and every form of shared ownership. It wasn't done out of anger, it was done for closure. The law had spoken clearly now, and so had I. I hung up and poured myself another cup of coffee, realizing how easy it was to fix something that had been broken for years. It took one visit, one envelope, and one decision to end a lifetime of emotional imbalance. Later that afternoon, I got a message from my neighbor. She said my son had driven past my house twice already. He didn't stop. He just slowed down, as if debating whether he had the right to come inside. He didn't. He had forfeited that right the moment he left my bag on his porch. I didn't move from my chair. I let him sit with that feeling. An hour later, my lawyer called again to confirm that my will had been updated. I had left something small for my granddaughter, a savings bond and a letter she would receive when she turned 21. But my son was no longer included. The lawyer didn't question my choice. He had seen this story play out in many families. I thanked him for his time and went back to my quiet afternoon. The peace that followed was unlike anything I'd known. There was no guilt, no hesitation, no sadness, just release. Years of emotional exhaustion had been replaced with something clean, a sense of control that had been missing for too long. My house, once filled with tension and waiting, now felt like mine again. That evening, my phone lit up with a text from my son. It was long, clumsy, and desperate. He wrote about how he didn't mean to leave the bag out, how it was all a misunderstanding, how he and his wife were just cleaning up. He said he wanted to fix things. He said he'd come over. I read every word and deleted the message. I had already heard those apologies before, the ones that only show up after consequences, not after conscience. He had mistaken comfort for love, authority for care. I wasn't going to let him make that mistake again. My porch light stayed off that night, my door stayed locked, and my silence said more than any speech could. Over the next few days, word spread among relatives. Some called to say they were shocked. Others whispered behind my back, saying I was harsh. But the ones who knew the truth said nothing. They just understood. Family can be the hardest mirror to look into. It reflects who we raised and what they became. I didn't raise greed, but life has a way of twisting gratitude into entitlement. My son had to learn that love doesn't mean ownership, it means choice, and I had made mine. By the end of that week, I finally stopped checking my phone. I didn't wait for updates or messages. I didn't expect apologies. I didn't even think about the bag anymore. The porch outside my home looked cleaner without it, just like my life did without the weight of false loyalty. I understood now that peace isn't found through forgiveness. Sometimes it's found through distance. He had shown me who he was. I had shown him who raised him. And for once, that lesson was going to stay. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between us became its own kind of language. I didn't expect calls anymore, and I didn't feel the ache I used to when my phone stayed quiet. The first few mornings were strange. I would catch myself checking messages out of habit, only to find none. But after a while, that stillness started to feel like peace. The house felt different too. The air was lighter, calmer, as if it had been waiting for me to finally stop waiting for him. I started to fill my days with small things again, things that belonged only to me. I cleaned the attic, sorted old photos, planted flowers in the backyard I'd ignored for years. It wasn't about distraction. It was about rediscovery. I realized that most of my life had revolved around being a mother, a provider, a problem solver. But now, for the first time in decades, I was just me. Every now and then, someone from the neighborhood would ask about my son. They meant well, but I could see the curiosity behind their eyes. I would simply say, "He's doing fine, I hope," and leave it there. The truth didn't need to be retold. The people who mattered already knew. What surprised me most was how normal everything started to feel once I stopped carrying the weight of disappointment. There was no more tension, no more pretending. The silence wasn't punishment, it was protection. Protecting my peace, my dignity, and my sense of self that had been chipped away slowly over the years. The world didn't collapse without his presence. In fact, it finally stood still long enough for me to breathe. I began to notice things I hadn't seen in years. The way the morning sun hit the kitchen tiles, the sound of birds outside the window, the comfort of a home that no longer felt like a waiting room. I even cooked a full meal one Sunday, not out of obligation, but out of joy. I ate alone, and it didn't feel lonely. It felt like freedom. The memories of that night on his porch still came back sometimes. The sight of that bag sitting there like a silent rejection. But now they didn't sting. They just reminded me of a turning point. Every parent reaches a moment where love has to change its shape. Mine had simply matured into distance. A few weeks later, I received a card in the mail. It was from my granddaughter. Inside was a simple message. "Grandma, I miss you." No apology, no mention of her father, just those 4 words and a small drawing she'd made. I pinned it on the fridge. That little note meant more than any grand gesture ever could. It reminded me that even when relationships fracture, kindness can still pass through the cracks. The next day, I mailed her a small letter in return, a gentle reminder that love doesn't have to live under the same roof to survive. As the days went on, I noticed how silence had become a teacher. It taught me that peace doesn't always come from fixing things. Sometimes it comes from leaving them broken and walking away. My son hadn't called again, and I no longer wondered why. Maybe he was ashamed, maybe he was still angry, maybe both. But none of it mattered. I had already found my closure the moment I stopped knocking on doors that wouldn't open. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full of relief. It held the sound of lessons learned, bridges burned, and a mother finally reclaiming her life. By the end of that month, I stopped keeping count of how long it had been since we spoke. Time moved differently now, slower, softer. My heart no longer raced when the phone rang. My days began with gratitude, not grief. The silence that once felt like abandonment now felt like independence. I understood then that the most powerful sound in the world isn't forgiveness or apology. It's peace, pure and uninterrupted. And I had finally earned it. I drove to see him because I missed the sound of family, I left because I finally heard the truth inside that silence. That night on his porch changed everything, not because of what he did, but because of what it made me realize about myself. I had spent most of my life giving, forgiving, and believing that love was about patience. But love without respect turns into servitude, and I was done serving those who couldn't see my worth. My son thought he had sent me a message by leaving that bag outside. What he didn't realize was that message became my beginning. The next morning, when he found my letter and the documents I left behind, his hand started shaking, not from anger but from realization. He saw in black and white what I had seen in his actions for years, that love is not something you can take for granted. The shock didn't come from losing money or property. It came from losing control. For the first time, he understood that I wasn't the helpless woman he imagined me to be. I had just been quiet, and quiet people are often the ones who plan the loudest lessons. After that day, I didn't need apologies or explanations. Life moved forward naturally, cleanly, without resentment. I found joy in the small, steady things: morning sunlight through the curtains, the smell of brewed coffee, the sound of rain tapping on my window. Every moment felt like proof that peace can exist after betrayal. I didn't wait for him to come back, but part of me knew he would, someday, not out of habit, but out of humility. And when that day came, I wouldn't open the door with bitterness. I'd simply nod, because forgiveness doesn't mean reopening wounds. It means closing the book and walking away with both hands steady. I've learned that family can love you deeply and still treat you carelessly. Sometimes the only way to teach them the value of kindness is by taking away the comfort they abused. My note was never revenge. It was reflection. It showed him, in one sentence, how it feels to be on the outside looking in. He called it cruelty. I called it consequence. And between those two words lies the truth most people never face: that respect is not automatic, even between blood. Now, when I think of him, I don't feel sadness. I feel distance, the kind that protects, not punishes, the kind that says, I remember what happened and I learned from it. There's no anger left, only understanding. Life gives us choices, to hold on or to let go. I chose to let go. I chose peace. My home is quiet, but not empty. It's filled with everything I once ignored: contentment, dignity, and a heart that no longer bends for anyone's approval. He once told me that family means never walking away. I disagree. Sometimes walking away is the only way to remind them you were standing there the whole time, waiting to be seen. And when they finally turn around, it's too late. Not because you stopped loving them, but because you finally started loving yourself more. I drove to my son's house to surprise him for dinner. I thought I'd be the one knocking on his door, but life had other plans. In the end, he was the one standing outside, holding a letter, trembling, realizing that love without gratitude is just expectation wearing disguise. I didn't need to say a word. My silence spoke. My note answered. His hands shook. Mine didn't.